Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adam Jollans. I work for IBM as the Linux and Open Source Strategy Manager, and that's a global role. I just happen to be based over here in the UK. Jeremy was very complimentary about IBM. I don't know if IBM is actually the biggest open source contributor. I know Intel are doing a phenomenal around open source. I know that Red Hat have got lots and lots of engineers and programmers now working on a whole variety of projects. But we are a big one, whatever. And what I wanted to share with you today is IBM's journey in terms of open source, because there's actually some interesting sort of things that happened, lots of learning for us in terms of what works, what doesn't work, how to approach things, how not to approach things in terms of open source, and it is a key part of our strategy. The story started in 1998, so that's what, now 17 years ago, okay, with the emergence of the web and what you do around web servers and web application servers. And IBM, as it did many times, built its own HTTP server, the IBM HTTP server, which we thought was very good and very powerful and very efficient, and nobody was using it. Okay. So at that stage, right, we sort of said, okay, do we want to then build all the software we're looking to build on top of an HTTP server that nobody uses, or do we want to actually look at other alternatives to that? At the same time, there was a lot of interest. I've got a reminder. No, that's Jeremy's reminder.
We're now seeing one of our customers. If that's fortunate, it's a public customer.
No worries. So luckily yes. So there was also an increasing interest in open source from various parts of IBM. So IBM Research, we've got a very large research group in IBM, was looking at open source and saying there's really cool stuff here. The development departments were saying we want to be able to use open source, we want to be able to contribute code to open source, but especially from a number of our leading edge customers who are actually starting to use open source and saying we want to do things with Linux, we want to do things with Apache. So back in 1998, we made a decision that we would not progress further with the IBM HTTP server. Instead of that, we would use the Apache HTTP server as the basis of our web stack and build things like WebSphere application server on top of it. But at the same time, we would actually start contributing programming resource into Apache in order to work with them on the Apache HTTP server. So, in terms of what did we learn at this stage in terms of how do you successfully participate in an open source community? So, as IBM does at these stages, we kicked off a study, a technical study to look at what was this open source thing, how can a group of volunteer programmers working together on a project possibly be better than rows and rows of IBM sort of programmers doing exactly what they're told to do from a design spec. And we found some really interesting things, and these will be obvious ones. It worked. Open source actually works as a development methodology. It produces good quality code, or it can produce really good quality code, okay? And there was an option there to get involved more. The biggest learning, I think, from this stage was in terms of open source involvement, code is king. Right? If you're going to get involved in open source, you need to actually be writing code, contributing to code, reading code, providing feedback on code. This isn't a marketing exercise, this isn't a managerial exercise, this is a programming exercise where you get involved in the community and you get to be able to contribute to the community by actually writing code. So what we did was we set up a hub for open source projects called the Linux Technology Center. That is still very much in existence today and is hosting many things beyond Linux. And this hub was where we would have the programmers who are going to be working on open source projects. Now, there's some reasons that you actually want to separate out open source programming from commercial programming. One is you want to make sure that your commercial programmers haven't learned things by working on an open source project which they then use in that same domain when they go into commercial projects. So you need to have some sort of separations here, okay? But also the way of approaching open source projects and having programmers involved in open source projects is different. Okay? Peer review plays a very, very major part in terms of open source development. The motivation for open source programmers, we found, was different to being a commercial programmer. So quite often, if you, at least in those stages, if you went in and were a commercial programmer, you were looking to become a manager a few years later or whatever. That was your career path within the organization. With open source programmers, they want to code open source stuff. They want to sort of do this programming, develop new things. And what's the reward for developing good open source code? Well, firstly, it's credibility within the open source community with your peers. And secondly, is you get to be able to code more open source. Okay? So these were programmers and engineers who we funded. We gave them the salary, we gave them the desks, we gave them the computers, we paid them, but they're working on open source as part of the open source community. That was a big shift in terms of culture as to how to approach it, but it gives us participation in those communities. Some of the benefits are, firstly, you get people who understand the open source project very well. So through this, we had Linux kernel hackers. So if we had a challenge with a customer and we needed to actually be able to go deep down into the Linux kernel in order to be able to help them out, we had that knowledge. Secondly, we had influence, but it's only influence in terms of where the open source community was going. And thirdly, we're able to include the function that we wanted. Now, one of the interesting things we found out of this stage was you get influence in the open source community, you don't get to make the decisions. Okay? This is a democratic process, whatever. Your credibility in that democratic process is based on merit, it's based on what you know about it, what you've done in the community. So it's a different model to a sort of a typical corporate development model, but it's a good one, and it works, again, well. But that was part of the learning at that stage. Okay, so the next stage that we went to in terms of our open source journey was Linux. So Apache, this was a fairly minor sort of involvement in the open source community, starting to learn about it. But then it became clear that that Linux was becoming significant, and we took a very detailed look at Linux. Now, as we go through this, clearly IBM's a commercial company. Okay? We try to be a nice company, we try to do nice things, but our decisions are based on business, commercial decisions, whatever. So if we can combine the two, that's great as well. So the situation we found ourselves in was the IT market was dominated by Windows and Unix, and that was likely to be the way it was going to be going forward. And we wanted to see, can we actually shape the market? Can we change the market by some of these decisions? Linux was also being adopted by companies for backroom tasks, for DNS servers, for simple web servers, for interfaces to the web. Often without the IT director knowing that it was happening. Okay. And in the early days of Linux, we used to sort of joke that when we spoke with IT directors and said, have you got any Linux in your organization? Okay. Half of them would say, no, we haven't got any Linux in our organization. And we knew they had. Yeah? And the other half would say, what's Linux? Okay. Now, clearly we've moved on a long, long way from that, because these days everybody's aware of Linux, everyone's probably got a Linux somewhere within their organization. But it was happening from the ground up. It was very much a sort of a grounds up movement that happened. We saw an opportunity for Linux to become an enterprise operating system. And today, Linux is very clearly an enterprise operating system, but back 15 years ago, it was unclear whether it was going to get to that stage, and we thought it can be an enterprise operating system. And so, along with a number of other companies and people and developers, we said, okay, let's try and make this into an enterprise operating system. IBM also has a number of different server systems with different architectures, different code sets, and this was an opportunity to potentially have a single operating system across that entire range. Now, it's interesting how these things happen. Obviously, Linux started on x86. You would like, or I would like, to be able to tell the tale that IBM made a senior executive decision to put Linux on the mainframe because we saw a strategic advantage there. That's not the way it happened at all. What happened was that a group of programmers at the IBM lab in Germany at Böblingen thought, wouldn't it be really cool if we could get Linux running on a mainframe? Let's give it a try and see if it works. Okay? So this was a backroom project that they thought, let's try it. They were told a number of times by their management to stop the project. Okay. Luckily they didn't, and they continued working on this at night to get Linux running on the mainframe. And then, as tends to happen in big organizations, this got spotted by a very senior executive who said, this is really cool, right, we should do something with this, whatever. And that was a guy called Irving Wadesky-Berger, who was very much a visionary in IBM at that time in terms of open source and Linux and also the internet. So that was the background. We then sort of said, okay, we need to go into Linux significantly. And what we decided to do is we'd have a big set of announcements and a coordinated breakout at one of the Linux shows. I think it was Linux World, where we would say, we're supporting Linux across our servers, across our software, or underneath our software, and with services for Linux. So a coordinated cross-company approach to this. We, at that stage, really established the Linux Technology Center, started hiring programmers and developing people who wanted to go into being open source programmers. We also had a keynote speech by the then CEO of IBM, Lou Gerstner, okay, and he said IBM is going to invest $1 billion into Linux over the coming years. And I mean, since then, there have actually been quite a lot of billion-dollar investments from various people, or whatever, but at that stage it was quite unusual, especially with what was sort of a fairly unknown operating system and seen as counterculture. And so this really, we think, helped to build credibility of it. And that investment was in terms of funding people in the Linux Technology Center, porting Linux to our various platforms, building services organizations, building the sales organizations, participation in events, all those sort of things. So a whole variety of things. We also, in conjunction with some other vendors, set up the Open Source Development Lab, or OSDL, which is the predecessor of the Linux Foundation. It's an earlier incarnation to really help make Linux enterprise ready, was the whole purpose of that. So what did we learn? Jeremy? Thanks. Can we click to the next? Is it going to be one of these? Page down.
Just do page down.
Page down, that'll be easier. Lost focus. Okay. Fabulous. So one of the things we then really looked at was business models, because as I say, IBM makes business decisions in these cases. We'll do the technical research, but we actually make business decisions. Okay, and so how do you make money from free software? How do you make software from being given away or whatever? So that is something I think that's come up multiple times during today. There's a whole range of different open source business models. Some of them are more successful than others. Okay? One of the early ones was in terms of distributing Linux. So that's how Red Hat started. That's how SUSE started, in terms of packaging it up, putting it on a CD, reselling the CD. Service and support is one of the most successful of the open source business models where you can get it to work. Red Hat have done this extremely successfully with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, where customers who want to use Linux want to be able to rely on support and are therefore prepared to pay for that ongoing support. And that has turned Red Hat into a more than $1 billion company, which is growing at a very, very fast rate. So service and support can be very successful as long, of course, as people want to pay for service and support. Okay? Because with Linux, you've always got a choice. You can actually download from the internet and sort of run it without service and support. Talked about having a base and enhanced version, whatever. Not sure how successful that is. You've also got dual licensing models. One of the interesting case studies in terms of open source is MySQL and where that has gone through from being one of the most popular open source projects to being bought for $1 billion by Sun, then going across to Oracle, and then losing some of its sort of open source direction, and MariaDB then coming up as a sort of equivalent open source project. And a lot of that then comes back to governance. How do you do the governance of an open source project, which I'll touch on going forward. Open source can do competitive displacement. It can change the market. If you're not in a sort of a number one or number two position in the market you're competing in, then an open source approach can actually really shake up that market and give you an opportunity to establish yourself there. You can get a halo effect. IBM got quite a bit of this with all we were doing around Linux and our $1 billion investment. It meant that as people were looking at Linux, they looked at IBM as well. But that's a marketing approach typically there. Also, to develop an operating system like Linux takes a phenomenal amount of money, okay? Phenomenal amounts of people to do so. If one company is trying to do that, so it's probably getting to the limits of being affordable for one company. If a lot of companies share development together, then you can reduce your development costs and get this basis on which you then add your value. And we're seeing the same with OpenStack, for example, in terms of the development there is shared across a lot of companies. That's one of the reasons we're in it. One of our business models is using Linux to actually cut our development expense by sharing the development, and therefore it's a sort of negative business model, but it actually works quite well. You can also, depending on the license, include in products, build products that sort of use open source. Example would be Linux being included in in-flight displays, entertainment systems or whatever, Linux being used in sort of embedded devices. So your product includes the open source. Now again, it depends on the licensing as to how much you can do this. And one of the less successful business models for Linux was cuddly toys, if you remember the penguin. But there was a stage where we heard that one of the Linux distributors was getting 10% of its revenue from cuddly toys. Now, that is no longer a market or whatever, so they're not as popular as they were.
Should have used meerkats.
Should have used meerkats. That is, you see, it works very well for other parts of the business. Just page down, Jeremy.
Should be, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so third example in terms of the early open source story of IBM was Eclipse. Okay, so Eclipse, again, the market was IT development dominated by Windows, whatever. Java emerging or whatever, but the Java developer market was fragmented with multiple offerings, whereas you had a consistent set from Microsoft. We, through an acquisition, had got a good Java integrated development environment, okay? But again, its share was low. Okay, so what can you do to sort of try to change the market? So what we did was we open sourced our Java IDE as Eclipse. We took the code, we open sourced it. Okay, it was clean code. We knew what the provenance of it was, so we could actually do that open sourcing. Okay, and we said to people, you can come along, you can provide plugins to Eclipse IDE, so you can then add value on top of that, but it's a sort of a standard base that everyone can use, and then provide the plugins for the sort of additional function beyond that. This worked to an extent, but the problem on that whole process was it's please come and join my party, but I'll decide what music you play. Okay, and if you're going to do really open source a project, you need to open source it as a level playing field. You need to open source it so you have vendor neutral, so other people can come along and play their music, whatever in that. And this was a big learning experience for this, and it was when we created the Eclipse Foundation in conjunction with other people, including Oracle, to actually put together a way of governing it, that we found that it really, really took off. And we've seen that into the future with OpenStack and things like that, in terms of having a level playing field becomes quite key. Some of the things that came out of Eclipse that we then used internally was somebody realized that this IDE, right, for development actually could provide a really neat way of providing the same graphical user interface across multiple platforms. So that's the Eclipse Rich Client platform, and that's what we've used to then build IBM Notes or Lotus Notes across Mac and Windows and Linux and so on. Okay, so you sometimes get things coming back from open source communities you're not expecting. So what we learned in terms of the code contributions to open source, some of the key considerations is, do you own the code? Okay. And if you've actually done sort of code development in the past, you may well not own the code. So you need to see, do you own the code? What's the quality of the code like? If you're going to open source this up, are people going to look at this and say, this is a spider's web, you should never have open sourced this? Okay. Is there a market opportunity? Are you going to provide differentiation in the market? What open source license do you use? Okay. And we tend to use, we've got an IBM license which is similar to the Apache license, so it's actually fairly liberal in terms of license. Obviously other things like Linux uses the GPL, and there's a mixture of licenses out there in the market. But two of the really key things there are you need a community. You need to build a community. If you open source the project and nobody comes along to help you, then what's the point? And people don't come along just because you've open sourced the project. Hey, we're IBM, we've open sourced this project, come and join us. They come along because of the things here in terms of, is there a market opportunity? Is the code good? Is this something people want to get involved with? And then the other thing is having a governance and an independent foundation actually managing it. So these three foundations of Apache, Linux, and Eclipse were where a lot of our activity around open source was for quite a lot of time. We then, in the last few years, things have accelerated. It's got really, really interesting in terms of open source. Okay. So one of the big ones that we've got involved with is OpenStack. Okay. I'm sure you're all familiar with OpenStack. Again, the market was dominated by a few proprietary vendors. A lot of interest in open source, infrastructure as a service, number of different options in that space. Okay. And the one that seemed to be the most interesting was OpenStack, developed by Rackspace and NASA. And so we got together with a number of other vendors and got them on board as well, including people like Red Hat, including people like Intel, to say, okay, let's combine our resources and work to help establish OpenStack as the leading open source infrastructure as a service framework. So we've put in a lot of programmers to the Linux Technology Center, worked with Rackspace and NASA in terms of establishing an independent foundation, and said, okay, we will now build our cloud software on top of this OpenStack foundation. OpenStack is probably now bigger than Linux in terms of the open source project. It's a phenomenal size. Certainly its conferences are bigger than the Linux conferences now, and it's a really big success. But in order to get that, you need this sort of critical mass here in terms of people involved in it, so that, I mean, the cloud stack is still around a bit in terms of Apache. Eucalyptus has largely dropped off the radar, so it's getting people to coalesce around one of the bases. Again, how do you create the community? I think we've probably covered a lot of this. You need the level playing field, you need a broad vendor participation, but you also need strong technical leadership. Again, this isn't a marketing thing. This is about having technical leaders working together in terms of doing that. Back to code is king on this. And you need the conferences and the education, and people need to see things are being adopted there. And you do need a bit of marketing at this stage, which is good. One of the interesting ones we then have gone into, this isn't pure open source. It has a number of open source elements. It's not pure open source. But again, marketplace, enterprise market, increasingly dominated by Intel x86. We have a processor called the Power Processor, which we think is really, really good. Okay, but it was only for IBM servers, so there was a limited market for it and a limited ecosystem around that. So again, decision made a couple of years ago to see would it make sense to open this up. We went and spoke with a number of the hyperscale data centers, especially with Google, and said, what would we need to do in order for you to be interested in this? And they said, change power from big endian to little endian, which is the ordering of the bytes in this space, and that's about making it easy to process data, making it easy to transfer applications. So we added that into our Power 8 processor. We said we'll license this technology, we'll allow other people to build it, other people to do variants of it, and modify it to optimize for their particular tasks. So if you're Google, you want to optimize some things. The fact it's open also meant that people were able to, China, for example, is very interested in open power because they're able to see into the detail and see that we haven't put sort of things in there to sort of check out what they're doing. Started off with 5 members. It's now something like 140 members of the Open Power Foundation. So I think the learning from this is there's more to open source than just software. Okay, there's open hardware, and I know there's things also, there's open hardware projects, there's the Open Compute project, there's open knowledge with Wikipedia, open education with some of the MOOCs, open data, and so on. So an open source approach actually has a real applicability beyond just open source software. So, as I say, things have really, really, really accelerated in terms of open source, both in the industry and with IBM. One of the things we're seeing with Linux and with open source projects is this is where the cool kids are now. If you look at where the innovation, a lot of the innovation is happening, it's happening with open source projects being built on top of Linux as a base. Whether it's the Googles or the Facebooks or the Twitters, whether it's things like Hadoop or Docker, look at a lot of the things that are coming through. These are open source projects that are happening. And it's the shared innovation, it's the ability to collaborate, it's really unleashed a phenomenal amount of activity in that space. Okay. From an IBM point of view, we have something over 500 programmers and engineers working full-time on open source projects as part of the open source community. Okay. And this is, as I say, this is one of the pretty cool jobs inside IBM, and part of it is the motivation reason, because when you're most programmers and engineers aren't particularly worried about salary as long as you get enough. Okay? But what they are really concerned about is, do people respect me? Am I seen as a good programmer? Do I have the credibility in the industry? And open source gives you credibility in the industry that you don't get within as much within an organization. If you're working on an internal IBM project, you might be respected inside IBM, but nobody's ever heard of you outside. If you're working on an open source project, lots of people outside will know what you're doing and respect you as well. We do a lot of support to Linux and open source conferences and support the foundations, and we're also working with the Linux Foundation on their collaborative projects. And collaborative projects are about encouraging the smaller new things, which get to be pretty big, like Cloud Foundry, like Node.js and so on, but to make it easy for them to get the structure and the governance and the support in place by being linked to the Linux Foundation resources. So what do we learn there? No, this one. What have we learned in terms of a big organisation managing open source? Firstly, you do need some control. Now, when you're in a smaller organisation, it's much easier to sort of control things. When you're in a really big organisation, you need to have some control. And early stage, we set up something called the Open Source Project Office, and their job is to be the coordination point and control what open source is used inside IBM, what involvement there is, to make sure people go through training and education, make sure we're not using open source which we don't have the right to use because people who posted it as open source didn't have the right to share in the first place but could contaminate us and sort of takes into legal problems. And getting people to participate in open source development. So they make the decisions. If you want to get involved in an open source project or open source software, you go and talk with them, and sort of they'll advise you. They can say these are the things that work, these are the things that don't work. Probably 10 years ago now, there was a special issue of the IBM Systems Journal which talked about IBM and open source, including a really good article which is available online in terms of IBM's story with open source and what we found out. Second thing is have a group within the organisation that's doing open source, where open source culture is the default, where people can get ideas from other open source projects. And thirdly, from a strategy point of view, look in terms of the market opportunities, look in terms of the business investments, and it comes back to it's a business decision at the end of the day. It's certainly been a good business decision for IBM in terms of getting involved in open source, and it's a good business decision, we think, for a lot of other people. So just to conclude, okay, and this is various of the projects we're involved in at the moment. What open source does, and it comes back to, I think, a quote from Isaac Newton, that if he's seen further than anybody else, is because he stood on the shoulders of giants. What happens with open source is you're able to build on top of the phenomenal work other people do, take it further, and we think it's got an amazing future. So, thank you very much. We got time for questions? Yeah.